Hello, welcome. My name is Nolafis, and today it's time to take a look at even more beginner mapping mistakes. But what do I mean by mistakes? Maps can be built for pretty much any purpose, and every player has their own definition on what makes a good map, so how can there be mistakes? When I'm going over the bad decisions in this video, I'm talking about the maps people make and then try to get track of the day with. The routes that are built with competitions in mind and need that general appeal. I've personally have had 4 track of the day maps, and I host viewer map review on my Twitch every Wednesday. So I know the process on how to get track of the day, and I've helped a lot of players improve their maps to achieve their goals. Which also means I've seen a few things over and over again that will kill a track's chances of getting through. And I'm going to cover a few more of those in today's video. These aren't in any particular order, and I didn't think too much about which ones came first, so don't think that these are listed by which ones are most important. They definitely aren't. For the record, it's perfectly fine to not go for track of the day. Some maps aren't meant to be taken too seriously, and even then, track of the day isn't the end goal for full maps anyway. I've covered this more in some of my other videos, but if you aren't going for mass appeal, then it's more than okay to not listen to this video. Build whatever you want to. And when you do decide to go for track of the day, then I'd recommend not doing what I'm about to be talking about. You do have to build to get as many people as possible to like the map, as map review is the biggest step to getting track of the day, and you'll need all the help you can get to make it through there. This first one has quite a few unintended consequences, and that's not putting down enough checkpoints. It's a pretty obvious sign that this is one of the mapper's first tracks when the route is 40 seconds long and there are 3 checkpoints. That leaves such a large space between that several things can go wrong. The most obvious is it opens the map up to some pretty easy cuts. And there is something fun about looking at a beginner's map and problem solving the fastest way to the finish, because if there's not that many checkpoints, the fastest way definitely isn't the intended one. But that will lead to some less than stellar scores in map review, as I doubt the map will be well calculated for the new route. And having a cut can make the map look a bit less polished. Now, I'm not saying that you're a bad mapper if the track does end up having a cut. 2 of the 4 maps I made for track of the day ended up being cut themselves, and I like to say that you aren't a real Trackmania mapper unless you've built a track that had an unintentional cut. But the existence of a cut can make grinding for a top time a huge chore and RNG grind depending on what the cut actually is, and spike the difficulty up to something you never intended. Or a cut can skip some interesting elements and make achieving the author medal incredibly easy and boring. Sometimes, the best way to prevent cutting is to add scenery to block off the reroute. Most of the time, I find at least, all you need is some more checkpoints. Even if there's not a cut to be found, it's not very fun to crash against a wall, respawn, and find yourself over 10 seconds back, especially if the section you crashed is especially tricky and takes a few attempts to get right. Having to drive through a few elements just to get another shot can quickly become tedious and frustrating, but not as anger-inducing as driving Cup of the Day, messing up one turn, and being eliminated because the respawn left you 10 seconds behind. Other players might have crashed too, some even worse than you, but their respawn was much less punishing. So they're on to the next round, and as far as you go, better luck next time. Before TM 2020, checkpoints were pretty much only used for cut prevention. Now, with the addition of flying respawns and Cup of the Day, checkpoints have an added responsibility of being good places to respawn from. If you're wondering how many checkpoints your map should have, a good rule of thumb is that a 40-second route should have a minimum of 6 checkpoints, and the players shouldn't go 10 seconds without hitting one. By placing a few more checkpoints throughout the route, cuts will have much less of an impact, and those respawns will be much friendlier. Risky finishes seem to be a staple of track of the day maps. If you're unsure of what these are, they're simply another finish that's faster but harder to get to. In my opinion, these are overrated, and most maps would probably be better without them, but that's a topic for a different video. Instead, I'm talking about the risky finishes that new players put into their maps. You can call them that, but I like to call them khaki finishes. Named after the iconic Trackmania competition where the maps are so insanely difficult, the winner is decided on who can beat the most, not who has the fastest time. And with that in mind, maybe you're starting to see what khaki finishes are like. Newer mappers build these because I assume they've seen a ton of other maps with actual risky finishes and want to cap their map off with a cool end too. Being new to the game, they're not entirely sure if a trick is just difficult or inconsistent, and it's that lack of knowledge when combined with the idea of a truly risky finish that gives birth to the khaki finish. Some of the hardest finishes I've ever played have happened on new player maps. The reason why it's bad is that the finish is so much harder than the rest of the map. So in order to get a personal best, you have to drive the entire map well and then throw yourself into the RNG finish in hopes of making it. Especially if the map is pretty easy, the difficulty spike comes out of nowhere and no one wants to grind a map where the first 45 seconds are simple, only to come across a lottery at the last moment where you hope you make it. Imagine playing Trackmania, but it was random whether or not your PB runs counted. I don't know about you, but I think a lot of people would stop playing. But to counteract this, if there's a risky fin, there's also a safe fin. You know, the one that's easy but slower. Typically, the safe fin isn't that much slower, and to guarantee that it's not the one to go for, it's common to put a slow-mo block in front of it. Just like with a khaki finish, however, some people go overboard with this. And I've come across more than my fair share of triple slow-mo gates into a long straightaway that ended up being over 15 seconds slower. At that point, why even have a safe fin? You obviously don't want anyone going for it, and if players are meant to grind for the gold and author medals, their only option is to take the khaki finish anyway. If I see these finishes on a map, I assume the mapper is new and doesn't understand what a risky fin actually is. In my opinion, a risky shouldn't be the hardest part of a map. It should match the difficulty and theme of the rest of the route, and a safe fin should only be necessary if the risky fin is unreachable after a crash. For example, if you have a speed tech route and you want a large jump into the finish, but the jump isn't possible to make if you crash the last corner, then having a secondary finish where the slower players can go is an excellent compromise. Or, to take an example from one of my own maps, Bubble Bath's risky fin required an air brake into a nose bounce. I knew not everyone was going to get this trick, so I put the safe fin directly behind so that players weren't punished too hard for not making it. At the very least, the risky fin should be consistent and reliable once you know what you're doing. It can require speed and for the player to have not crashed for a bit, but as long as that criteria is met, the risky should be doable every time. If you're trying to build a risky fin and you don't make it every time, make it easier. You're the one who put it together, so if you're struggling, imagine how much pain someone seeing it for their first time is going to go through to try to get it for themselves. As far as safe finishes go, don't make them that much slower. Sure, you want to make your other finish faster, but you also don't want to punish the player taking the safe route more than the player that crashed. Make the safe fin a couple seconds slower max. Anything more than that is almost forcing the player to go for the risky fin anyway, as if they miss, they can respawn and try again, and they won't be that much slower than the safe fin regardless. Personally, if I build a risky fin, the safe is never more than 1 second slower. Just keep the risky consistent and the safe not too punishing, and your finishes will be looking a lot better. Alright, so taking a look at the background footage here, it should be pretty obvious. I mean, look at this. It's awful. Disgusting, really. I'm actually not sure if I should be putting this in the video. No, don't worry. You aren't missing anything. At least, not until this jump scare. Ah, no. Ooh, don't hurt me. No. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you too badly, and I probably should have picked a less scary image, but anyway, blindness. Blindness is the point I'm trying to make. No, I'm not talking about literally making the screen black for the drivers, but instead players should be able to see what's coming up so they'll be able to prepare for it. Whether that's landing a jump, lining up a drift, getting on the correct side of the road, whatever. If the players can't do this, then their discovery runs will be full of respawns. which isn't necessarily bad, but if you're going through map review and people only have 3 minutes, spending that time awkwardly bouncing off corners and barely getting a run through will net you lower scores, as players won't have the extra runs to realize the map is well calculated. Outside of map review, players will be forced to memorize a lot of what's happening, which can make hunting a map frustrating, as it turns a lot of elements into guessing games instead of tests of skill. I don't see this too much when a map is still being worked on. There's minimal scenery and generally speaking the view isn't that obstructed. However, this is a much more common problem with finished maps. What seems like a simple intuitive route once it was first made can quickly turn into a frustrating obstacle course if players aren't allowed to prepare. This is where the placement of scenery really matters. As you get better at the game, your vision tends to get further and further away from the car itself. You learn to trust where the car is currently at and to look ahead at what's next. So think about where the players will be looking and don't place blocks in the way. The most common example I encounter are big blocks on the inside of turns. It can look cool when placing everything in the editor, but once you get to actually driving it, you don't know when the turn ends. There's no visual indication and you're reduced to just guessing. Move those blocks back a bit and let players see the exit of the element. If you need a couple more examples, players should be able to see the apex of a drift as they're lining it up and know what to aim for when going off a jump. Sometimes, however, especially with that last example, the element is going to be blind no matter what. The route itself is in the way. Just like how scenery can obstruct views, it can also enhance clarity. If I have a blind jump, I'll use scenery to help guide the player, either by using poles or lights to mark where they should and shouldn't land, or restricting the entry to the jump, guaranteeing the only place to go is the correct one. If you have a big turn coming up, having the players approach a large wall will let them know they aren't continuing forward. And I'll also use signs to help indicate sudden changes of direction. All of these little details will help guide the player through the route on the first few discovery runs. And if people can get one more run through your map in track review, that might just be enough to get that 5-star rating. This next one is a bit harder to define. Thankfully, I've made an entire video about this idea, but I'll still try to quickly go over what map flow actually is, and in the case of this video, what a lack of it looks like. Flow is how well one element of a map leads to the next one. If you've ever played a map that felt like each element was selected by using a random number generator, that's a lack of flow. The map doesn't feel like a cohesive route and instead feels jumbled. Like the thought process through building was, I guess I'll put a turn down here, and loops are pretty cool, maybe another turn, and then some boosters into a big jump. Now that we have that, I kind of want to test out dirt, so I'll put in a couple of turns of that. Another loop is cool, and then some more boosters into the finish. I mean, the map is drivable and can be fun, but when looking for a polished competitive experience, there's a lot left to be desired. A map with good flow thinks about where the car will end up after each element, and take that position into account when putting in the next one, versus my example, which kind of put everything down willy-nilly without much thought. For a concrete example, let's take a look at a typical bobsled turn. The car is riding along the wall for the duration and comes down at the end. Building with flow would involve thinking about how the car comes off that wall, and using that momentum to perfectly lead the car into the next element. Instead, what I see a lot in new players' maps is a bob turn into a straight block into another bob turn in the same direction. The car isn't naturally in a position to take that turn smoothly, and now the player has to overcorrect to make up for it. Instead of working with the route to go as fast as possible, the player is now wrestling against the map to try to get that PB. A lack of flow can make a map feel cheap or rushed, like the elements and turns built weren't chosen specifically because they worked, but were rather constructed with no thought at all. It can lead to a frustrating driving experience where a map is actively punishing a player for trying to go faster, rather than rewarding good lines with a smooth route. If you're looking for a bit more information about this topic, I'll leave a link to my video all about map flow in the description. I'm just happy I never make anything with drawing transitions and that. Speaking of building with purpose, it's important to build multiple places in a map where people can gain or lose time. That seems very obvious at first, but if you don't keep it in mind, you might just build a map where only one element matters. But what does that really mean? Almost everything you do in Trackmania will either gain or lose you time, but in this regard, not all elements are created equal. A drift, for example, can lose a player a bunch of time when compared to a simple grass turn. If you're going for that PB, you'll have to drive both optimally, but one is a lot easier to fall further behind on. In fact, a singular drift is the most common example I see of this. The beginning of the map will be some speed fun shenanigans, followed by a drift in the middle, where it's more speed fun until the finish line. The map looks good on the surface and has decent flow, but when it comes to hunting a good time, that singular drift is the only element on the map that really slows the card down. Meaning if you don't exit that drift with good speed, there's no other place in the map to make up that time loss. Sure, you might be able to take a few plastic turns closer on the inside, and that might save a couple tenths, but that singular drift is responsible for way more time than that. And if you really take it poorly, you can lose full seconds on that one element, with no hope of catching back up. When hunting, it's annoying and doesn't create the most fun map to drive over and over again, but where this is really bad is for live competitions, such as Cup of the Day. One of the best feelings in the entire game is being on the verge of elimination, only to clutch out the last couple turns and snipe someone else to still be in.
Yeah, fifth it is, I'm afraid. Damn! What the? Like, oh my god! How?
However, if there's only one place to meaningfully gain time, there's no push and pull, no place to make that triumphant return, and that's a lot less exciting and fun. To make sure this doesn't happen, I avoid building one-off elements, meaning if there's a drift, I always build at least 2 or 3. If there's some weird gimmick, such as a plastic bounce, I don't just build one. This helps the map have a strong identity as well as guarantee everything won't boil down to one turn. The route will seem much more calculated, well thought out, and exciting. And there you have it. 5 more beginner mapping mistakes. To recap, make sure you have enough checkpoints. Please keep risky finishes consistent. Keep the route ahead clear. Have each element smoothly lead into the next one, and don't reduce your map to a single corner. Follow these tips and your maps will be driving much better in no time. Especially if your goal is to get track of the day, you'll need all the help you can get to make it through map review. If you've made it all the way here, you might be interested in making Trackmania maps, and you're in the right place. If you want to see more, I'd appreciate you liking the video and subscribing. I also stream on Twitch every Wednesday night and most Sundays, where on those Wednesday nights I host viewer map review. If you want to submit your track early, to guarantee we'll take a look at it, join my Discord and you can send your map in a day early. If you have any questions, comments, or screams of anguish, please leave them down below. And I think that's all the self-advertisement out of the way. The only thing left to do is to say thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch my video. I really do appreciate it. And now, if you'll excuse me, it's time to build a turtle trial map in the middle of my full speed route. Bye.